Hola chums. So this is just a quick introduction to explain why I'm re-uploading a new version of an old video. And let me just start by saying, oh god, I really do like to make life difficult for myself. So why is this a special edition version of 25 years of Daytona USA then? Well, at the end of last year I got the idea in my head to upscale the original 1080p version of 25 years of Daytona that I made back in 2018 to 4K, and then re-upload it to YouTube to have a better quality copy available. You see, back then, every time I uploaded something in 1080p to YouTube, the video quality would get utterly mangled after the video had finished processing, no matter how crystal clear it looked or how big or small the bitrate was of the original video file. And eventually I figured out the way to stop this happening was to render my videos into 4K. But then I thought, well, why stop at just upscaling the video? Why not add a couple of new sections in too? There were some bits and pieces about a few of the different games I felt I could have expanded upon a bit more. Things I felt I probably should have mentioned in version 1 of this video but didn't. So for this version, I did. So I added some new bits in and did my first test render in 4K. After it had finished rendering, I realised all the original footage wasn't upscaling well and looked janky as F because I'd previously kept the bitrate of the original video as low as possible. This was because I was on such a painfully slow internet connection back then. Big video files used to just take such a long time to upload. Seriously, the original video file was just under 10 gigabytes and took me about 4 solid days to upload. So this is where the oh god part comes in. As I realised I couldn't get away with just simply upscaling the video, I was going to need to replace all that bad quality footage too, if I didn't want the project to just look like some half-arsed effort. Luckily, in some instances, I still had the good quality original gameplay videos I could superimpose back over the top of the rather janky low quality footage in the original version of 25 years of Daytona. But I also ended up just video capturing a whole ton of new footage to use in the project, to the point now that I'd say that almost all of the video has been overlaid with either new footage or the better quality original video files. And then after I added in some new sections to specific bits, I found myself thinking, well, now that I've mentioned this or added that section in, I can't leave this other bit out, and bits I hadn't originally planned on expanding upon suddenly started getting bigger too. To the point now that I've made substantial additions to pretty much every section of the video where I'm talking about all the different Daytona games. I think the only section of the video that I didn't add any new voice track to was the part about the original Saturn version of Daytona USA. As with the previous video, I'll add timestamps to the description of all the different sections, so people can jump in and out without having to do the whole video in one sitting. So yeah, thought this was just going to be a simple update, ended up turning into some monstrously large project that's just pretty much taken over my life for the last 2 weeks. So if you're someone who's never seen this video before, I hope you enjoy it. And if you're someone that has seen the original before, I do hope that you give this new version a go. There really is so much new stuff in it, I think you'll enjoy it. And if it all goes to plan, then hopefully it should look about 10 squillion times better than the original version. Anyway, this introduction's gone on for far too long. Let's get cracking with 25 years of Daytona USA
4K Special Edition.
Do 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 do. In August this year, one of the greatest arcade races known to mankind, Daytona USA, turns 25 years old. So let's look at the phenomenon that was Daytona USA in the arcade. We'll look at its home ports, its sequels and its legacy, as we celebrate 25 years of Daytona USA.
Please choose manual. Gentlemen, start your engine.
Daytona USA is an arcade racing game that was produced by Sega AM2 that saw a limited release in Japanese arcades in 1993, followed shortly after this by a worldwide release in April 1994. It was the first game to utilise Sega's brand new Model 2 arcade board, and at the time its sleek, texture matte polygon graphics that ran at a blistering 60 frames per second were unlike anything that had been seen in the arcade before. Because at this particular time in the early 1990s, the transition from sprite-based 2D to fully 3D polygon-based arcade games was still a relatively new thing. And my first real taste of a 3D polygon arcade racing title before Daytona USA came in 1992 in the form of Virtua Racing, a game also produced by Sega, which came out on the Model 1 arcade board, the predecessor, as I'm sure you've been able to work out yourself from the name, of the Model 2 arcade board. And one of the greatest innovations in moving away from sprite-based 2D graphics to 3D polygon graphics is the ability to choose what viewpoint you actually want to play the game in. And Virtua Racing very handily named them all. So you've got the fly mode, the furthest one away from the car, the float mode moving in a bit closer, follow mode which looks more like your traditional 2D arcade racing games, and finally the cockpit view. And this innovation was something that was carried across into Daytona USA as well. And the ability to choose what view you want to play in is something which has pretty much become a staple of all modern driving games now. And as revolutionary and amazing looking as Virtua Racing looked at the time, there's no doubt that simply adding these textures to the flat polygons of Daytona USA really does make the game look so much better. Although ironically, I have seen it mentioned that apparently Daytona USA has actually got a lower polygon count than Virtua Racing, so it's actually not having to do quite as much on screen as Virtua Racing is in terms of the amount of squares and triangles it's moving around or something. Can you tell that I'm not really all that bothered about the technical details? But fancy graphics weren't the only thing that Daytona USA had going for it. It also had the most important thing of all. It was bloody good fun to play. The game is made up of 3 different stages, each of which represents a different difficulty level. The beginner stage, 3-7 Speedway. The advanced stage, Dinosaur Canyon. And the expert stage, C Side Street Galaxy. And in true Sega Racer style, the game is easy to pick up and play, but difficult to truly master. The game came in a variety of sit-down cabinet types, although I can't recall ever seeing any stand-up ones, and my first ever experience playing it was in a massive 8-player setup, very similar to the one on screen here. And chuffing heck, this game really was great fun if you're playing it with a big group of mates. Even just playing the multiplayer with a group of complete strangers was brilliant fun, as you'd see the look of frustration as you successfully managed to slam an opponent's car into the sonic wall and laugh maniacally to yourself as they flip out uncontrollably. But despite the very fun pick up and play nature of Daytona USA, if you look a bit more in depth at the game, under the hood so to speak, see what I did there, you'll find the throbbing engine of an arcade racing game with a surprising amount of depth built into its play mechanics. And yes, I realise that throbbing engine does indeed sound innuendo-tastic, but hey, what are you going to do? And the nuances in these gameplay mechanics begin to become apparent when players graduate from automatic transmission to manual gears, with players who opt to use manual gears not only gaining a speed advantage over their human opponents, but also being able to use the gears to initiate a gear drift, where you fly around a corner at much greater speeds than you would if you were braking. Most pro players will tend to do it with a 4-2-4 drifting method, but I must admit I tend to find it a little bit easier doing a 4-1-3-4 method to get round the corner. It just seems to be a little bit easier to control. Another advanced technique in the game was the rocket start, achieved by keeping your foot on the accelerator just enough to keep the tachometer between 6 and 7 RPMs whilst keeping the brake firmly depressed. As soon as the starting grid turns green, release the brake and then fully depress the accelerator to achieve the rocket start. It's often easier said than done. As well as the regular arcade mode, the game also featured a time attack mode, accessible by pressing the start button down when you were selecting the stage you wanted to play on. This gave you free rein on the track with none of those pesky CPU cars to get in the way and interfere with your all-important lap times. Interestingly, whilst we're on the subject of the CPU cars, the game will analyse how well you're doing on your first lap. If you're playing poorly, the CPU cars will move out the way more for you as you're playing. If you're playing well, they'll be right obstructive pricks and get right in your way. The game also featured a few quirky little secrets as well. In both normal arcade and time attack mode, it's possible to turn the car around and start playing the track in reverse. Once you go through your first reverse checkpoint, your time will get extended and your lap times will start registering.
Wrong way!
Another amusing, quirky little feature of the game was that when you got to the name entry screen, if you input certain initials, it would trigger jingle tracks from previous Sega titles. Let's have a quick listen to a couple of them.
A, B. O, R. N, A, G. S, H, O.
Another secret function of the game is that all the music can be overridden by holding one of the VR buttons down during the Gentleman Start Your Engine screen. VR1 plays The King of Speed, VR2 plays Let's Go Away, VR3 plays Sky High, and VR4 plays the secret bonus track Pounding Pavement. On 3.7 Speedway you can actually take a shortcut through the pit lane if you manage to keep your wheels just on the side of the verge as you're going through it, which actually stops the car from pitting in. This is a technique you'll see top players doing when they're trying to get super fast lap times. It's quite an advanced technique, and to be honest I find it hard enough just trying to get it to work one time, let alone trying to do it 8 times in a row. Because if your position's slightly out, you'll end up pitting in and undoing all that good work that you just did. Like I've just done here. In a regular race, there isn't really any advantage to pitting in. It repairs any cosmetic damage to the car, but in the regular arcade mode, this cosmetic damage doesn't make any difference to the performance of the car. However, arcade operators had the option to change the game into a special Grand Prix or endurance mode, in which you'd get much longer races. And I mean much longer. The beginner stage alone needs 80 laps to complete in endurance mode. Flippin' heck. The arcade operator could also turn on a handicap mode in the game, and with that activated, players racing in Grand Prix or endurance mode will start getting tyre wear, which means that pitting in is essential. In the regular arcade mode, the no handicap option is normally activated by default, and the effect this has is to increase the top speed of all the players that aren't in first place, in order to try and keep the matches a little bit closer and fast paced. It's possible to turn the handicap mode off at the course selection screen, by keeping all 4 of the view select buttons pressed down when you're selecting your course. If more than half the players in the multiplayer game choose to do that, then the speed boost will be disabled. On the beginner stage you can actually stop the bars on the giant slot machine as you drive round by pressing the start button. The bars move from left to right and each press of the start button will stop them in turn. If you manage to get 3 7s in a row you get a time bonus. If you manage to get 3 bars in a row you get a slightly smaller time bonus. Oh, nearly had it, but not quite. On Dinosaur Canyon, there was a secret little bit of extra track that led off backwards from the pit lane. If you went up it and into the little alcove at the back, there was an interesting message for you.
Turn around!
And finally, on the Seaside Street Galaxy stage, if you stopped by the statue of Jeffrey from Virtua Fighter, and then continued to press the start button, you could make him dance around. Now, legend has it that as well as the 4 standard views that are available in the game, there's also a secret 5th aerial one, which views the car from above, which is supposedly accessible by pressing the Start, 2, 3 and 4 VR buttons together. But I've never managed to get it to work, and the only video evidence of this that I can find online is by someone who actually says in their video description that they weren't able to get this working with the buttons either, and resorted to a bit of hackery. They also go on to state that in this mode, if you go into the pit lane, it causes the game to crash. So this makes me wonder if this secret view is just a bit of an urban myth, and was more likely to be a feature that the developers used, which was then subsequently left on the cutting room floor, and then later discovered by people who were able to hack into the game's ROM. I could be completely wrong about this though, so let me know if you have managed to access this secret view in the arcade machine without any hackery. Now, it would be impossible to do a retrospective of Daytona USA without talking about the actual vehicle that the player controls when they're playing the game, because in some respects, the car's become almost as iconic as the actual game itself. Car number 41, the Hornet High Class. It's a stock car that was loosely based on a Chevrolet Beretta. The number 41 is the game's producer Toshihiro Nagoshi's lucky number. Seems like a bit of an oddly specific lucky number to me, but hey, what do I know, I'm not a genius Japanese games producer. Toshihiro-san apparently came up with the idea for Daytona USA following a trip to a NASCAR track whilst he was visiting North America. He was inspired by the fast and frenetic action that he saw on the track and wanted to try and create an arcade experience that would capture this excitement, and thus Daytona USA came to be. The arcade version of Daytona USA was critically lauded when it first came out, and even today it'll still place highly in lists of the best arcade games ever and the most influential driving games of all time. And like any successful arcade title from back in the day, it inevitably ended up with its fair share of home conversions and sequels, and in the video I plan to cover every single one of these. Now, I'm going to try and do this mainly with video capture footage that I've obtained myself of me actually playing these games, but already I can think of a couple of instances where this isn't going to be possible. So for any footage I use that isn't something I've captured myself, I will put the name of the uploader and the name of the video on screen, and also add a link to it in the video description as well. So without further ado, let's move on to our first home port of Daytona USA, which was for the Sega Saturn in 1995. Released in 1995, the Sega Saturn version of Daytona USA was in fact a launch title for the console, and like the console itself, it was unfortunately rush released, and as such it did not utilise the full power of the Saturn. The game ran at a dismal 20 frames per second, and also had a very poor draw distance, which meant that scenery tended to just pop up out of nowhere when you were racing around the courses. And if that wasn't enough, the PAL version of the game had great big ugly black borders at the top and bottom of the screen as well. And as well as looking crap, the Saturn version of Daytona was also missing another vital component from the arcade machine. There was no two-player split screen option, a feature which even the humble Sega Mega Drive version of Virtua Racing had managed to include in the game. Now, I've mentioned before in one of my other videos about Sega arcade racing games that I think that the fact that the Saturn version of Daytona USA looked like such complete and utter shite is one of the things which actually had a negative impact on the sales of the machine when it very first came out. The Saturn launched over here in the UK for an exorbitant £399. Now if you think that that doesn't sound too bad, remember that this is 1995 that we're talking about. So just because I can, I've used an inflation calculator to work out what that would be in today's money. Almost £630, which is considerably higher than the average launch price of a contemporary console. So the point I'm trying to make here is that the Saturn wasn't cheap when it came out. It was an expensive console, and this is the game that they were hoping would encourage people to buy it. A home port that looked like an incredibly poor relation of the arcade machine, that lacked any multiplayer modes to boot. Now later on in the same year, the Saturn received a port as Sega Rally, which seemed to fix all of these problems. It ran at a far more impressive 30 frames per second. The draw distance was greatly improved, with far less pop-up going on as you played the game. And if that wasn't enough, they'd managed to squeeze a two-player split-screen mode in as well. Sadly though, first impressions count, and unfortunately for the Saturn, a lot of those first impressions would have been based on the suboptimal port of Daytona USA that came out on the system when it was first released. Particularly as Daytona USA tended to be used as a demonstration game in game shops to demonstrate the alleged capabilities of this brand new 32-bit machine. I think it's really no wonder that so many people flocked over to the PS1, especially considering it was £100 cheaper than the Saturn. And I do often wonder to myself how much of a difference it would have made to the Saturn's fortunes if the launch version of Daytona had looked like this instead of the rush-released crap version that they ended up with. Now, being the loyal Sega fanboy that I was back then, I did eventually end up picking up a Saturn, but I didn't get mine until 1996, and I also managed to get it second hand, which meant it only cost £90. Now what's interesting about the fact that I picked up the Saturn a little bit later in its life cycle is that around this time there were a lot of rumours doing the rounds in the UK Sega Saturn magazines that suggested that Sega were planning on bringing out a new remastered version of Daytona USA for the Saturn, which would correct a lot of the flaws of the original conversion, and that this new version was being created by the same team that did Sega Rally on the Saturn. Now owing to this fact, despite being a massive fan of Daytona USA back then, I never actually owned the original version on the Saturn, and my only experiences of playing it have come through modern day emulation, which is what I'm playing it on here, using an emulator called SSF. Now despite all the visual drawbacks of the Saturn version, a lot of the Daytona purists out there will argue that underneath all this, you still do have the basic bare bones of the Daytona USA gameplay, translated to a home system fairly intact. And I think I can sort of see where they're coming from. I'm playing the game here with digital control, so obviously the steering feels very different to the arcade machine, but I have also got the gear set up to individual buttons, which means that I can go from first to third to fourth, literally as I said, at the press of a button, which means initiating the gear drift does feel sort of similar to the way that it does when I'm playing this with a pad in modern versions of Daytona USA. The game was also compatible with the Sega Saturn racing wheel and 3D analog pad, so it would be interesting to see just how much closer to the arcade version it feels with those peripherals, rather than the digital controls that I'm restricted to here. The game did have some additional features that weren't in the arcade mode, such as the ability to play a couple of bonus cars, which were palette swap versions of the original with slightly different stats. There was also the bizarre ability to play as a horse in the game as well, with a different colour representing manual and automatic gears. The game also featured a karaoke mode, in case you had an overwhelming desire to sing along to the song's lyrics whilst you were playing. There was also an option to race on reversed versions of the tracks, allowing you to play them in a mirror mode, along with secret codes that you could enter in the name entry screen at the end of a race, which would allow you to hear small excerpts of music from previous Sega games. The Saturn version of Daytona USA was ported to Windows PCs in 1996, and according to the website SegaRetro.org, it offers only limited improvements over its console counterpart, with frame rate, draw distance and camera transitions being very similar between the two versions. SegaRetro.org also go on to mention that in Japan there were two different versions of the game, owing to the changing nature of the PC market over there at the time. So let's move on now to our next version of Daytona USA, which is also for the Sega Saturn, and this is that rumoured improved version that I'd first heard about back in 1996 when I first bought my Sega Saturn. A version of the game which would go on to be called Daytona USA Championship Circuit Edition. Now, in the original version of this video, this was the point where I explained that although I do own a Sega Saturn still, I actually sold my copy of Championship Circuit Edition about 10 years ago. Well, that'll be closer to 13 now. So I was using a Saturn emulator called SSF to emulate the game, and the emulation wasn't perfect, it was causing problems with flickery graphics. Well, I'm now using one called Yaba Sanshiro, and rather than causing any problems with the graphics, this upscales it into 1080p and actually makes the game look really quite incredibly crisp. Even just beyond the artificial improvements that the emulator adds, I think the improvements in this game compared to the first are obvious from a visual point of view, with the game now running at a much faster 30 frames per second, and also getting rid of those ugly black borders at the top and bottom of the screen that the PAL version had. Improved graphics weren't the only change to the game though. The game now also featured a selection of different cars and also 2 brand new tracks, National Park Speedway and Desert City. Let's have a quick look at them both now. I love all the little touches you get on these tracks, like the train going round here on Desert City, the balloons that you see later, and the roller coaster on National Park Speedway and the funfair. These are all little visual flourishes really reminiscent of Sega of old, and the attention to detail they used to like to put into their games, just to make them feel that little bit extra special. One of the other great things as well about the Saturn version of Daytona USA Championship Circuit Edition is the fact that not only did it provide all this extra content compared to the original game, but they also managed to squeeze a split-screen 2-player mode in there as well. Now, one of the curious things about this game is the fact that it was handled by Sega AM3 rather than Sega AM2, and Sega AM3 were the guys who'd made the Saturn's port of Sega Rally. And by all accounts, Daytona USA Championship Circuit Edition, that's a real mouthful to have to keep saying that, I'm just going to call it CCE from now on, was also based around the same game engine that they'd used for the Saturn version of Sega Rally, which led to complaints from some players that the game now no longer felt like Daytona USA. Now, whilst I could see that this would be a source of frustration for some people, I have to admit that this didn't bother me at all back in the 90s when I actually owned the game. Because in all honesty back then, I used to only ever play the arcade machine on the beginner stage, and to me this felt like a close enough approximation of it, just being played with my regular Saturn pad. Just like the first version of Daytona USA on the Saturn, CCE also had support for the arcade racer wheel, and the Saturn's 3D control pad, something which I probably could have done with here judging by the shit driving on display. The 2 unlockable horses from the first game also make a reappearance here. And something which the more eagle-eyed amongst you may have noticed already, the original Hornet was not amongst the initial selection of cars that you could choose, only becoming available once you'd managed to get first place in all the tracks on the normal difficulty. The initial selection of cars have all got different strengths and weaknesses, with some having a much greater emphasis on grip and acceleration, and others having more of an emphasis on maximum speed. Unlike the regular selectable cars though, once you unlock the Hornet, it has 5 stars in everything: grip, acceleration and speed. Now, I don't have the Hornet unlocked in this emulated version of CCE that I'm playing here, but I had previously unlocked it in the 1997 PC port of Daytona USA Championship Edition, which was called Daytona USA Deluxe. And one of the things that's interesting about Daytona USA Deluxe is that on top of the Saturn's 2 new tracks, it had an additional third one called Silver Ocean Causeway. So let's have a look at this PC exclusive track, together with this secret unlockable version of the Hornet racing on it.
And they're underway.
Although I keep referring to this car as the Hornet, technically its real name is Daytona, as there is already a version of the Hornet in CCE and Daytona USA Deluxe. And with its 5-star maxed out stats, it doesn't really handle anything like the Hornet from the original arcade game. It's a bit like when I used to play Street Fighter Alpha 2 on my Saturn using Shin Akuma, and you just breeze through all the other opponents. Another brilliant Saturn game, by the way. So as well as the extra track, we can see that Daytona USA Deluxe offers higher resolution gameplay than its Saturn counterpart, along with clearer 2D graphics like the HUD, and also an improved draw distance as well. Since the game was initially released, it's received a Direct 3D patch, which adds in texture filtering and also a fogging effect which is trying to hide geometry pop-in. And you can see that effect working in the gameplay here. I think it sort of works, but you do still notice the pop-in though. But I think this does help give the game just a little bit more of a graphical edge over CCE on the Saturn. And as well as having better graphics and an extra track, Daytona USA Deluxe also supported an 8-player network, a feature of the game I've never tried myself. Daytona USA Deluxe also added in some additional options to change the game's handling and suspension. Apart from the handling, which I normally like to make just a little bit less sensitive if I'm using the game's analog controls, I don't really tend to bother fiddling with any of the other options. Another quirky new feature of Daytona USA Deluxe was the ability to choose what time of day you raced at, with the game giving you an additional 5 options to choose on top of the regular daytime mode. The effect is quite variable in how it works, with some of the settings, like the Twilight one here, actually looking quite interesting. But others, like the Midnight setting, just making it look like your PC monitor's broken. Now, one of the other features of Daytona USA that we haven't talked about so far is its soundtrack. The soundtrack was composed and performed by Takenobu Mitsuyoshi, who came up with the novel idea of giving the game proper songs, which he sang the lyrics to. So whilst contemporary driving games at the time, such as the Ridge Racer series, were going for more of a techno feel, with thumping bass and banging rave tunes, Mitsuyoshi created sunny pop tunes, with memorable lyrics about flying sky high and I think that regardless of whether you think these tunes are a load of cheesy nonsense, or that they're heavenly sonnets right up there with the best works of Beethoven and Mozart, there's no doubt in my mind that they're definitely a factor that's helped contribute to the game's iconic status. When it came to Championship Circuit Edition though, Sega brought in Richard Jacks and Jun Sinu to produce a new remix soundtrack. Jun Sinui, I'm sure I'm probably pronouncing his name wrong, is a veteran Sega music composer with an impressively vast back catalogue of Sega games under his belt that he was responsible for doing the music for. with his specialty being electric guitar. He's also a member of the band Crush 40. He composed the game's introductory song, Sons of Angels. The vocals were performed by 80s rock supremo Eric Martin, who was the lead singer of the band, Mr. Big. I can't say I'm particularly familiar with any of their work, but then I was more of a raver than a rocker back then. I still am. I do like Sons of Angels a lot though, and I do think it is a really good way of actually introducing the game. Richard Jacks is a name that you'll probably be familiar with if you played any of the Sonic and All-Star Racing games that came out last generation, with Sonic and All-Star Transformed being a particular musical highlight for me, with some really excellent dancey remixes of classic Sega theme tunes, and some particularly good drum and bass ones as well. Richard Jacks has got an equally impressive vast back catalogue of games that he's worked on, and if you're old like me, you probably first encountered his work back in the Sega Saturn days, with Sonic R being my first introduction to his work. Another old game with an absolutely outstanding soundtrack, which, despite being a little bit on the cheesy side, I still often find myself going back to for a listen from time to time. Particularly when I've just staggered home from the pub on a Friday night after about 10 pints, and I need a little bit of Euro cheese in my life before I go to bed. But anyway, that's enough about my post-pub Friday night antics. Let's talk a bit more about this game. So I'd mentioned earlier in the video that Daytona USA Deluxe had the ability to support an 8-player network, but something I only found out about myself a few years ago was that in North America there was a special Saturn version of CCE that came out that supported a network. And this came as a complete surprise to me, because as a European owner of a Sega Saturn, I never even knew back then that the Saturn had any online functionality, because the Saturn Netlink modem only ever came out in North America. Now, as someone that was suitably impressed when the Sega Dreamcast came out with an online function, I have to say that this is pretty mind-blowing to think that the Sega Saturn actually had this back in the mid-1990s. I mean, this is incredible. Now, something else that's incredible about this game is the amount of money that it goes for these days. So again, according to our friends over at SegaRetro.org, this version of the game is widely believed to be the rarest North American Sega Saturn game, with an eBay sighting recently going for $1,100. Well, fuck me sideways, that is an awful lot of money. Japanese Sega Saturn players wouldn't get a copy of this game until 1997. The game dropped the Championship title from its name and became simply Circuit Edition. It's much the same game as CCE, although AM3 had continued to work on the project and made some minor improvements in areas such as draw distance and texture quality, as well as offering more gameplay and music options, giving players the option to choose the original arcade versions of the songs, as well as the remix tunes. Like Daytona USA Deluxe, there was now an option to choose what time of day you wanted to play your chosen stage at. New drift mechanics had also been implemented to enable the game to control more similarly to the arcade version. The game also supported the Sega Saturn modem for online play, Japan's equivalent to the Netlink internet modem that they had in North America. What happened to us in Europe, Sega? How come we never got a modem? Now, another Daytona USA oddity, and something else which I've only just become aware of fairly recently, is Daytona USA Deluxe Special Edition. Now, whilst it sounds like a complete game, Daytona USA Deluxe Special Edition is actually a demo version of Daytona USA Deluxe for the PC, modified to include the Skittles Racing Team brand. And much like the Netlink version of Daytona USA CCE, copies of this have been spotted on eBay for very inflated prices. As a demo version of the game, the only car that's playable is the CCE version of the Hornet, replete with a new Skittles themed paint job. The other thing which you can't have failed to notice is the frigging great big rainbow which now stretches across Dinosaur Canyon. The graphical effect that's so saccharine, it's rumoured to have been responsible for many cases of childhood diabetes in North America. Well, I think we've pretty comprehensively covered Daytona USA Championship Circuit Edition now. Let's move on to our next home port of the game. But before we do, let's just have a quick comparison between the original Saturn version of Daytona USA and CCE, with both games running on Yabasan Emulator.
Gentlemen, start your engine.
So hey, just before we leave the 32-bit era of gaming, I just want to segue sideways into something that was relevant to this particular time period, which is the fact that around about the time the Saturn game came out, several games mags in the UK had suggested that the 32X was going to get a port of Daytona USA as well. And the story goes that development did actually start on it before eventually being cancelled. Now it's hard to know if there's any truth to any of this or not, and I think back then sometimes some of the magazines did get a little bit overexcited and tend to embellish some of the facts a little bit for some of their exclusives. It's curious to think though what a 32X version of Daytona USA could have turned out like, and I'm guessing probably the closest real life equivalent we've got to it was using the stock car in Virtua Racing Deluxe on the 32X. Amusingly, king of the UK gaming mags back then, Mean Machine Sega, played an April Fool's prank on their readers, where they said that in Virtua Racing Deluxe there was a certain bit of track that you could find, and that once you'd reached it, if you drove your car to spell out the letters that spelt the word Daytona, you would unlock 37 Speedway as a secret bonus stage. They nearly had me going with that for a bit as well, until I realised the article was written by someone called Mr. Lee Poo Fal. Also, completely unrelated to any of that, but something that I forgot to mention in the original video, so this seemed as good a place as any to shoehorn it in. There was an LCD handheld version of Daytona USA made by Tiger Electronics. I've never actually seen one of these in real life. Tiger's handhelds got released by Grandstand in the UK, so I don't know if it was even available over here. But apparently it was part of Tiger's VRT X range, in which the game would be projected as a pseudo-hologram image onto the screen. Ooh, sounds fancy. I bet in reality though it probably looked just as rubbish as all those other LCD handheld games did back then. Anyway, with that little bit of miscellaneous trivia out the way, it's time to leave the 32-bit era behind. So hold on to your butts as we unleash
128-bit mega power
with the Sega Dreamcast version of Daytona USA. Daytona USA 2001 was a 2000 release for the Sega Dreamcast, co-released by Sega, Hasbro and Infogrames, as Sega no longer held on to the license for the Daytona brand. The game was an update to the original 1993 title, and as well as including brand new fancy graphics, which were now arguably better than the Model 2 originals, the game also boasted a whole load of new cars to play as, some of which were immediately available, others required unlocking by meeting certain conditions in-game, and also a whole load of new tracks to play on as well. So as well as the original 3 arcade Daytona USA tracks, it also included new and visually improved versions of the 2 tracks from Daytona USA CCE that came out on the Saturn. On top of these 5 tracks were 3 brand new tracks. I'm going to let the game introduce them.
Circuit Pixie. Rin Rin Ring. Mermaid Lake.
So let's have a quick look now at all of these new tracks and new cars in action.
Checkpoint.
Your time's extended. Check your position.
Checkpoint.
You're underway. Stay low in the turns.
Checkpoint.
Your time's extended. 7 laps to go. Stay low in the turns.
Checkpoint.
Your time's extended.
Checkpoint.
Your time's extended.
Checkpoint.
Your time's extended. Stay low in the turn.
Checkpoint.
Your time's extended. 2 laps to go.
Checkpoint.
Your time's extended. This is the final lap. Stay low in the turn.
Checkpoint.
Your time's extended. Stay low in the turn.
Checkpoint.
Your time's extended.
Checkpoint.
Your time's extended. Stay low in the turn. Rear bumper.
Checkpoint.
Your time's extended. 2 laps to go. Stay low in the turn. Rear bumper.
Checkpoint.
Your time's extended. This is the final lap. Stay low in the turn.
Checkpoint.
Your time's extended. Stay low in the turn. You're looking good. Stay low in the turn.
On top of all this, the game also offered an option to play on all the stages at sunset and included a huge amount of new, original and remixed music from the game. The game also featured a 2-player split-screen mode, which managed to maintain a rock-steady 60 frames per second, even with 2 screens worth of action going on. So in many ways, this sounds like it should be the absolute perfect version of Daytona USA. It's arguably got better graphics than the original arcade game, it's got tons of extra cars and music, not to mention 5 brand new stages, as well as a whole host of customization options. So as well as being able to choose custom colours for your car, you could also tweak the individual handling of each of the cars by choosing whether you wanted soft, medium or hard tyres, with 5 options being present altogether. The game let you tailor your racing experience even further to your liking, by letting you choose the amount of cars that were involved in the race and the amount of laps you wanted to do. Additionally, the game also let you decide if you wanted to play the track in a mirrored mode or reversed, or a mirrored reverse mode if you wanted to make life really difficult for yourself.
Checkpoint.
Your time's extended. 2 laps to go. Stay low in the turn. Stay low in the turn.
Checkpoint.
Your time's extended.
Checkpoint.
Your time's extended. Stay low in the turn.
The mirrored tracks have even got their own remix soundtrack, which is pretty cool. Another addition to Daytona USA 2001 was the Championship mode, where the player must place above a certain point in the overall rankings to progress, culminating in the King of Daytona Cup. Nice. So the game is absolutely packed with content and customization options, so it sounds like it ought to be the ultimate version of Daytona ever, right? But despite all the Daytona-y goodness on offer here, there was unfortunately one big problem with this game, and that problem was that the controls were just too flippin' sensitive if you were trying to play it with a pad. Now, I've mentioned the story of how I came by my copy of Daytona USA 2001 for the Dreamcast before in another one of my videos, so you'll have to forgive me if I'm repeating myself here, but there is a bit of context to this. So I picked up my copy of Daytona USA for the Dreamcast when I was on holiday in Thailand back in 2001. A market seller in Bangkok was selling Dreamcast games for ridiculously cheap prices, the equivalent of just like a couple of beers over there. The games themselves were obviously bootleg, but as the price was so cheap, I decided to take a gamble and see if they'd work on my UK Dreamcast when I got home. I thought at worst, what's happened is I bought a novelty Daytona USA looking drinks coaster. To my utter amazement, when I got home, not only did the game work, it turned out to be a Japanese version of the game that worked absolutely fine on my English Dreamcast. And the reason that I mention this is because when the game eventually got a Western release, it had additional options added to it that let you tweak the sensitivity of the car's handling. And as it was, the Japanese version that I had was practically unplayable with a pad. With the handling of the car being so sensitive, it was very easy to oversteer and then end up skidding and fishtailing all over the place. In a bid to try and improve things, I even ended up buying one of these McLaren racing wheels for the Dreamcast, but unfortunately it didn't really seem to make any difference. The handling still just felt off and not like the arcade. It wasn't until many years later when I tried the Dreamcast emulator D-Mule on my PC and I played Daytona USA 2001 using my racing wheel that I really truly began to appreciate the game. And in fact, using the PC steering wheel, the game handles so well it's possible to keep it perfectly in sync with the proper arcade version of Daytona USA.
White flag is out. Your time's extended. This is the final lap.
In North America, the 2001 title was dropped from the game, and it went back to being just Daytona USA. Now, something else that was different about the North American and Japanese versions of Daytona USA 2001 were the fact that they both had network play for up to 4 players online, but for some reason this feature was removed from the PAL version. Now, I never actually tried getting online with the Japanese version of the game that I had, because I just assumed that the dial-up modem would be trying to contact a local number over there, and would therefore just never connect, seeing as I was ringing from the UK. My only experience of playing the Dreamcast online back in the day was on the puzzle game Choo Choo Rocket, which wasn't exactly very graphically demanding, but despite this though, the gameplay was still very laggy, just using the Dreamcast built-in dial-up modem. So if you're a gamer from the US or Japan, or any of the other regions that supported network play for Daytona USA 2001, I'd be interested in knowing what your online experiences were like with this game, and just how well it played using a dial-up modem. The game was the brainchild of Toshihiro Nagoshi, and another thing that's curious about the game is why they decided to release Daytona USA for the Dreamcast, when there was a certain other Toshihiro Nagoshi arcade game that had been doing the rounds in the arcades round about this time that might possibly have been a better fit for the Dreamcast. Now, I suspect you're probably all ahead of me here in guessing what that game is, but we'll talk about that a little bit later on. Now, I think that pretty effectively wraps up Daytona USA 2001. The next home port which I played after this was for the PlayStation 3. But before that though, I want to talk about something else that happened in between then. A little something called Model 2 Emulator. Now, I very first got into emulators about 10 years ago, and the very first emulator I ever got working on my PC was MAME, and the very first game I ever played on it was R-Type 2, which you can see running in the background here. And I'll let you in on a little secret here. The first time I got this game running, it absolutely blew my mind. Now, those of you brought up on modern games with expensive cinematic intros and photorealistic 3D graphics are probably wondering just what I found so incredible about getting this old 2D shoot 'em up working on my PC. But the thing that absolutely blew my mind was the fact that this was an actual arcade game running on my home computer. And it wasn't long after I'd tracked down copies of pretty much every single one of my favourite 2D arcade games that I found out that there was a specific emulator for Model 2 arcade games, and the thought that I could possibly get the actual arcade version of Daytona USA running on my PC blew my mind even more. Getting hold of a copy of the emulator was pretty straightforward, but trying to find a working Daytona USA ROM turned out to be quite a headache for some reason. All the versions of the game I was finding at your usual dodgy ROM sharing sites all seemed to be missing files and just didn't want to work. Eventually though, I did manage to find a copy from a source that at the time I used to associate more with movies and music, a torrent sharing site whose name you can work out by taking this gentleman's profession and then combining it with this gentleman's surname. So having now finally got my hands on a working ROM, I loaded the game up for the first time, and this is what it looked like on my old Pentium 4 processor PC. Having finally got the game working, it turned out my bloody PC wasn't powerful enough to play it. The frame rate was choppy as hell, and you probably noticed all that stuttery audio right at the start of the game. On top of which, the game wasn't really playable properly using a PC joypad, because the X-axis sensitivity was just so high, as it was configured for the much larger range of movement of an arcade steering wheel, rather than the much smaller X-axis of a thumbstick on a joypad. Now, you might be wondering why I'm going into so much detail about my own personal experiences with this emulator. And the reason for that is, as a big Daytona USA fan, I want to highlight the lengths and the expense that I was prepared to go to back then to get this game working properly on my PC. And it quickly began to dawn on me that the only way I was going to get that to happen was by improving my PC hardware. And as an absolute home computer novice back then, the thought of taking the side off my PC and fiddling around with the hardware inside it filled me with absolute terror at the thought of accidentally breaking something, all for the sake of an arcade game. I started off by buying an extra gigabyte of RAM for the Pentium 4, taking it up to its full capacity of 2 gigabytes, but to be honest that did absolutely nothing. The next step was to upgrade my graphics card, again another nightmare for a computer novice like me, as I was trying to figure out if I had an AGP or a PCI slot and whether my power supply unit would be up to the challenge of actually giving this thing enough juice in the first place. In many ways, buying this card really was an expensive leap of faith, because I had no idea whether this would actually work or not. Eventually the card arrived in the post. I installed it, kept my fingers crossed, fired up the game for the first time, and I had the motherfucking arcade version of Daytona USA working on my PC at full speed. Boom! Now, admittedly, I still couldn't play the game properly with the joypad, but this was a major hurdle that I'd cleared. The Model 2 emulator didn't just replicate the arcade game's graphics, it actually enhanced them. Later versions of the emulator allowed you to play the game in HD resolutions, and also added in an optional widescreen mode. It wasn't until some time later that I eventually got the controls sorted, when a random visit to a game shop before a trip to the cinema ended up with me coming home with one of these bad boys. A Thrustmaster Ferrari GT Experience 3-in-1 racing wheel, which was on sale for the special price of £39, which was actually less money than it would have cost me to buy a new DualShock 3 pad for my PlayStation 3. Again, this was another leap of faith purchase, as I had no idea if I'd be able to configure this properly to work with the game. On the plus side though, it was also PlayStation 3 compatible, as well as working on the PC, so even if it didn't work with Daytona USA, it wouldn't have been a complete loss. Now, I mentioned earlier in the video that I'd previously bought a third-party racing wheel for the Dreamcast to try and improve the handling of Daytona USA 2001, but that particular wheel had just turned out to be a big plasticky piece of shite. So I was keeping my expectations tempered as to how good this wheel would play with the original arcade version of Daytona. But holy chuffing heck! Once I'd got all the controls properly configured, this really did feel like I was properly playing the arcade version at home. It was amazing. The steering felt absolutely spot on. The only things missing to really make this feel like a true arcade experience were the fact that the Thrustmaster wheel didn't have a proper four-way gear shifter. Instead it relied on paddle shifters underneath the wheel itself. This wasn't really an issue for me back then though, as I hadn't started using manual gears at this point and tended to stick mainly with automatic transmission. The other thing that was missing was the fact that the Thrustmaster wheel didn't support force feedback, a feature that Model 2 emulator supported for certain games. The Thrustmaster wheel though did support something called vibration feedback, which was basically a rumble feature that would happen in place of force feedback effects in certain parts of the game. And for me at the time, this was certainly good enough to add to the authentic Daytona experience. Many years later though, I was fortunate enough to inherit a Driving Force GT racing wheel off my brother-in-law when he was getting rid of his PlayStation 3, so I can now play this game with the full force feedback effects working properly. Additionally, once I first started to use manual gears as well, I found it was actually relatively simple to just use the face buttons on the wheel as an alternative to a proper 8-shifter gear stick, which meant that I could easily swap between first, second, third and fourth gear at the press of a button. Now, not content with giving you a near arcade-perfect single-player experience, Model 2 emulator lets you link up multiple versions of itself to simulate an arcade network. And it's possible to do this in multiple ways, with multiple different players as well. So in this first example here, I'm playing against a friend on a wireless LAN across two different PCs, using the two different racing wheels that I'd previously spoken about. It's also possible to get multiple versions of the emulator working on one single PC. In this next video I've got 4 different versions of the emulator running on a single PC in a 3-player mode against 2 other friends. All 3 of us have gone back to the decidedly iffy version of controlling the cars by using joypads here, as there isn't really a practical way I could fit both my steering wheels in front of one screen, and also just to keep things fair between the 3 of us. It's even possible to do a combination of multi-PC and single PC multiplayer together. In this next video I'm demonstrating a 3-player setup with one PC running 2 linked versions of the emulator using 2 different screens, with the second PC wirelessly linked in as player 3. So the Model 2 emulator has actually got 2 modes of network emulation, both with some drawbacks. The default mode is not synced at all. While this works pretty well, it causes flickering in the cars, which is something you can't have failed to notice in the video here. There is also a version that you can do called frame synced, but the problem with this is it sometimes causes the game to stop for a second or two. A member of the Build Your Own Arcade Controls forum, who goes by the name of Sailor Sat, has created a tool that fixes this flickering issue, but I must admit I've not got round to actually giving it a try myself yet. So whilst the Model 2 emulator version of Daytona USA isn't a home port, I still felt it was significant enough to mention here in this video, because after the highs and lows of the Saturn and Dreamcast versions of Daytona USA, getting to play an actual proper arcade perfect version of Daytona USA at home, right down to the handling and the multiplayer, really was a dream come true. The original developer of Model 2 emulator was a Spanish guy by the name of El Semi, and rumour has it that based on the impressive work that he'd done with the emulator, he was then subsequently offered a job at Sega, and then went on to work on the next ports of Daytona USA, which were released in 2011 for the PlayStation 3 and Xbox 360. So let's have a look at those versions next. Now, although I do own both of those consoles, I only own the PlayStation 3 version of Daytona USA, so all of the footage in the next segment is going to be exclusively from that version. So as I just mentioned in the last section of the video, in 2011 the PlayStation 3 and Xbox 360 both got their own ports of Daytona USA, which were available as digital only downloads. Now I think it's fair to say that the announcement of these ports came as somewhat of a surprise to most people, myself included, because just 2 short years before this in 2009, the original Daytona had made a sort of return to the arcades. Sega Racing Classics was essentially an HD and widescreen port of the original Daytona USA, which was running on the newest Sega arcade board at the time, which was known as the Sega Ringwide, but bizarrely with all the Daytona USA branding removed, presumably because Sega had lost a license to use it at this point, which made it all the more surprising when it was announced that a proper port of Daytona USA, not Sega Racing Classic, would then be coming to the at the time next generation consoles. The Sega Ringwide board was essentially PC based hardware, and just in the last few years, the arcade version of Sega Racing Classic has been made playable on PC through a specific arcade loader crack. I personally have never actually given this hacked version a try. I can't really see the point, seeing as Model 2 emulator already supports HD resolutions, and I've also got an HD console version at home to play as well. And that HD console version is the one that you can see playing in the background here, my PS3 version of Daytona USA. And something else that these home console versions of Daytona USA improve upon compared to the actual original arcade version is the game's draw distance, with the odd bit of pop-up that used to happen in the actual Model 2 board now completely eliminated. Another massive improvement compared to previous home ports of Daytona USA is the fact that these versions were also optimised for people that were playing with pads as well as people using racing wheels. In the video here I'm just playing the game with a regular PlayStation 3 DualShock 3 pad. And just on the game's default setting I haven't had to mess around with the X-axis sensitivity at all. It handles absolutely perfect as it is, with no fishtailing or problems with oversteering or anything like that. So for my money this is definitely the best handling home port of Daytona USA if you are just using a pad. Players with racing wheels won't be disappointed either, with all of the game's original arcade force feedback effects being present, and also to me noticeably stronger than they are in Model 2 Emulator. If you crank the force feedback effects right up to maximum in this game, it does feel to me like you're almost in danger of losing an arm. Another interesting feature of the PS3 and Xbox 360 versions of Daytona USA was the inclusion of the Rewind mode. The Rewind mode was a feature which was available initially only in a limited supply, which gradually increased the more you played the game. Basically what it allowed was that if you crashed, you could rewind the game back to a point before the crash to still try and get that absolutely perfect lap. This was also quite handy as well if you wanted to practice on a particularly difficult part of the track, like this nightmare hairpin that you get at the end of the expert course. In a further bid to increase the longevity of the game, Sega included some extra challenge modes that you could complete, which included certain things like having to reach a certain speed within a certain time limit, or just simply getting to the goal in time. It also saw the return of the Saturn version's karaoke mode. Now I must admit, in all honesty, I personally never actually played any of these extra challenges or the karaoke mode. I've just been too busy playing the main game itself. Now one of the other really awesome things about the PlayStation 3 and Xbox 360 versions of Daytona USA was the fact that they both supported online play, with up to 8 players being able to take part in an online match. Ooh, hello from the future. And by the future, what I mean is that this is an updated part of the video from 2021. This was the part of the video where previously I cut away to someone else's footage of an 8-player game, and I mentioned that back when the game very first came out in 2011, I was able to take part in a very small number of 8-player online matches myself, and that they were brilliant fun. I also mentioned though that sadly the number of online players dried up very quickly, and those couple of early 8-player games turned out to be the exception, and the norm was really to only find maybe 2 or 3 players online, and that it wasn't long before that turned to 0. However, I also mentioned that I was quite surprised to find out that just 1 year before I released the original version of this video, back in 2018, that you could actually still play the game online, when my mate, Initial Dale, contacted me when I was in the middle of video capturing something else on the PS3, and we played a few games which I video captured. After that, we were able to get another one of Dale's mates involved and get some 3-player games going. Since then though, by using the power of social media and YouTube, I've actually been able to organise a few online sessions myself. Initially, using the YouTube community section and Facebook, I managed to organise a lobby with a maximum of 5 players in. But after I made a dedicated YouTube video asking for players to get together for a game, it resulted in me once again being able to experience a full 8-player lobby. In fact, the call to arms to organise some online games proved so successful, it actually ended up in another full lobby going on at the same time as the one that I was in. Since that initial 8-player success story, I've been able to do it again, organising another 8-player session that proved popular enough to create 2 lobbies once again. As a result of this, I've now been able to play the game in every single one of the different multiplayer colours available, something I thought I'd never get the opportunity to experience. It's incredible to think that it's still possible to get involved in these big online races 9 years after the game originally came out. It's worth just mentioning here as well that it's also possible to still get online on Sega's other PS3 arcade race supports, Sega Rally Online Arcade, a slightly visually stripped down port of Sega's 2008 Europa R-board arcade title Sega Rally 3, and Outrun Online Arcade. So the online Sega old school racing fun times don't need to stop at Daytona USA. And it cannot be emphasised enough just how much fun it is to play Daytona USA with a full 8 players, having 7 other human opponents on the track, trying to smash you off the track and into the walls, whilst you're trying to do the same to them. It really does add an extra element of fun to the gameplay. So all in all, the PlayStation 3 and Xbox 360 versions of Daytona USA are about as close to a perfect port of the game as you can get. A port that manages to enhance the graphics while still maintaining the aesthetic quality of the original game. and a port that handles very well just using a regular joypad. Now if I were to level a couple of criticisms at this game, my first would be this: no local multiplayer. I mean, honestly Sega, how difficult would it have been just to have simply added a 4-player split screen mode? Playing online's cool and all, but it's never going to be able to replicate that feeling of fun that you get when you're playing with a big group of mates in the same room. My other criticism would be with the lack of new content in the game, when you think that both the Dreamcast and the Saturn managed to introduce extra stages and extra cars. Now I suspect that that's probably down to the fact that there's a certain amount of emulation-y magic going on here, rather than the game being a straight port built from the ground up like those other versions were. The game does feature a mirror mode option to play the tracks in, but still, just some new stuff would have been really nice. So the PlayStation 3, Xbox 360 and then later Xbox One ports of the game do represent the last conversions of Daytona USA to home systems. So with that, it's time to look at the game's sequel, pseudo-sequel and its legacy. Daytona USA's first true sequel came in 1998 in the form of Daytona USA 2 Battle on the Edge. Daytona USA 2 ran on the successor to the Model 2 board, Sega's brand new Model 3 arcade hardware that had debuted 2 years earlier with the arcade racer Scud Race. Upon its release, the Model 3 board was more powerful than any other arcade platform on the market and was light years ahead of anything that the home console and computer markets could do at the time. This is reflected in the graphics, which you can see are a massive step up from the original Daytona USA that I think could still give a lot of contemporary games a run for their money. Just like the first game, Daytona 2 gave you a choice of 3 different tracks to choose from, of varying difficulties. The beginner, Astro Waterfall Speedway, the advanced track, Joyopolis 2020 Amusement Park, and the expert stage, Virtuous City. But unlike the original Daytona, it now gave you a selection of 3 different cars to choose from, that varied in the difficulty of their handling, with players that opted to go for the hard level car being rewarded with greater top speed and a greater drifting ability. One notable omission though from the car selection screen was the original Hornet that looked like it had been benched in favour of these 3 new cars. Anyway, let's have a look at all of these cars and tracks in action, starting with the Chums Gums car, the beginner level car, on the beginner circuit.
Watch that red line on the track! Time extension. Time extension. Time extension.
So much like the original Daytona USA, drifting was the name of the game here. Unlike the first game though, there was much more of an emphasis on using both the brakes and the gears to drift here. Trying to drift using the gears alone would often result in the car spinning out, particularly if you're using the hard level car, the Phantom Full Force. Despite the differences in the handling between Daytona USA 1 and 2, one thing that stayed the same was the rocket start, which once again involved keeping your foot fully depressed on the brake whilst trying to keep the tachometer as close to 7 RPMs as possible by partially depressing the accelerator. As soon as the countdown finishes, release the brake, fully depress the accelerator and immediately shift up to 2 whilst trying not to drive into the cars in front of you. There was also a much greater emphasis on drafting in Daytona USA 2, the technique whereby you position yourself behind an opponent's car and take advantage of the decreased wind resistance that you get, increasing your top speed. The game also had some secret functions, such as a time attack mode, an additional 4 secret views on top of the 4 regular ones,
Time extension. 7 laps to go. Hang in there. Time extension. Time extension. Time extension.
As well as the secret views, there was also another secret option that let you play the game in a mirror mode. Battle on the Edge's successor actually managed to go one better than this by adding in an option that let you play the tracks in reverse, which lets you see previously unseen details on the track, like this big face here just before you get to the funfair section on the advanced stage. Or just after it, I suppose I should say, if you're playing in reverse mode. And the subway train here on the expert course, which I can't say I've ever really noticed before when I'm playing it the right way round. You could even mix and match the reverse and mirrored mode and play the game in reverse in mirrored mode. Playing the game this way really messes with my head in terms of my expectations of what corner should be coming up next. But we are jumping the gun just a little bit by talking about that game here. We'll come on to that in a bit. Much like the first Daytona, there was an option in the game's test menu that allowed arcade operators to change the game to either a Grand Prix or an endurance mode, which greatly increased the number of laps you needed to do. In the Grand Prix mode, the beginner, advanced and expert courses required 40, 20 and 10 laps respectively to complete, The endurance mode took things up to an even more insane level, with races that could be set to either 100 miles, 200 miles, 300 miles, 400 miles or 500 miles. If you set the endurance mode to its highest setting, you had to complete 500 laps of the beginner stage, 223 laps of the advanced stage, and 87 laps of the expert stage. Frigging hell, that is a lot of Daytona. As you played through the endurance mode, your car would slowly run out of gas and your tyres would gradually get worn down, which would decrease your car's performance, requiring you to pit in to sort these problems out. This added a tactical element to the gameplay that you didn't normally get in the regular sprint arcade mode, so the game was jam-packed with secrets and options. There was even an option that let you change the person who sang the songs in the game. Not long after the release of Battle on the Edge, a new and updated version of Daytona USA 2 came out, called Power Edition. Power Edition featured a couple of notable changes from Battle on the Edge, the first being the return of the Hornet as a playable car, complete with its Daytona 1 physics intact. The next biggest change was the beginner stage's environment. In Power Edition they dropped the biodome of the first game and decided to go for more of a generic NASCAR type track instead. Now, I have got absolutely no idea why they made this change. I don't know if perhaps they wanted to make the game appeal more to the North American market, which is after all the home of NASCAR. And perhaps the biodome setting just seemed too fantastical. Perhaps they made the changes to try and make the game seem aesthetically more similar to the first Daytona. Who knows? All I can say is it seems like a real shame, as the biodome is definitely a lot more interesting looking than this track. Not that I've got anything against it, mind you. Something else that changed was the paint job of the Easy Level car, with the sponsors being changed from Chum's Gums to the equally fictitious JC Eagle. Again, I'm not sure why this change was made, but I guess maybe the sight of the two cuddly little bears on the back of the Chum's Gums car just didn't seem manly enough for the NASCAR loving guys in the US. Again, I think this change was a bit of a shame because I think the Chum's Gums car has just got a little bit more character than the JC Eagle one. Perhaps the biggest change of all though was the inclusion of something called the Challenge Mode. The Challenge Mode combined the advanced, expert and beginner stages into one long course that you race through seamlessly with no break in the action. It's a brilliant idea and definitely something that would have added to the longevity factor of this game. As far as a few minor changes go, the game's introduction was slightly different to Battle on the Edge, and the car's handling had also been changed slightly, with some subtle changes in the drift physics between the two games. Now, I've got to admit, playing the two different games, I can't actually tell any difference in how things handle myself, but I definitely think Battle on the Edge has got more aggressive AI, which makes the game a little bit harder than Power Edition. Just like the original Daytona USA, Daytona USA 2 also supported multiplayer, with the difference being this time that this game could actually support a massive multiplayer network of 16 players. Wow! Back in the day though, the biggest amount of Daytona USA 2 cabs that I ever saw linked together was 8. I would be interested to know, dear viewers, if any of you got to enjoy a 16-player setup on this game back in the day. Let me know in the comments. Now, despite being the sequel to one of the most successful arcade racing games of all time, for some strange reason, Daytona USA 2 never ever received a home port. I've previously made another video where I talked in depth about all the possible reasons why this game and certain other Model 3 games never got home ports, so I'm not going to go into detail about that again here. But what I thought has always been especially puzzling is the fact that Sega decided to re-release Daytona USA 1 on the Dreamcast rather than making a port of this game, particularly as Toshihiro Nagoshi was a producer on Daytona USA 2 and design director on Daytona USA 2001. It's also puzzling as well, considering that Daytona USA 2001 had 3 entirely brand new tracks created for it, that someone at Sega didn't just think, hey, let's just put the Daytona USA 2 tracks in the game instead. Now, despite never getting a home port of its own, the Daytona USA 2 tracks did eventually turn up in another Sega game, with the challenge course from Power Edition appearing as an unlockable bonus in Outrun 2 on the original Xbox. The two games have got very different handling physics, so playing the challenge course in Outrun 2 does feel like a slightly different gameplay experience. But as a tribute to a slice of Sega arcade racing history that never received a home port, it's an incredibly nice touch and a very welcome addition to the game. The challenge course in the Japanese version of Outrun 2 would go on to have further cosmetic improvements to make it even closer to the original arcade version of Power Edition. And just like the regular stages in Outrun 2, the Daytona USA 2 bonus stages were also playable in Xbox System Link multiplayer, with I think a maximum of 6 people being able to link up their Xboxes. Despite never receiving a home port, Daytona USA 2 did eventually become playable on home computers back in 2011 through the wonders of modern emulation and a specific emulator called Supermodel. And this is where all the footage from Battle on the Edge and Power Edition has come from that you've been watching in the video. Since that time, refinements in the emulation have steadily improved, to the point that the game seems to me to be arcade perfect now, complete with force feedback and everything. And much like Model 2 emulator, it actually improves on the original arcade game by adding in an optional widescreen mode and the option to play in HD resolutions. The latest versions of Supermodel have even started to include an experimental network build, allowing you to link up multiple versions of the emulator for multiplayer, although at present this is still work in progress and doesn't run full speed. Now, one of the interesting things about arcade ROMs getting dumped and then emulated is that it gives hackers and coders a chance to poke around in the original ROM's code and see if they can find anything interesting. And one such find was that the Hornet Classic was actually included in Battle on the Edge, but it just never made the final cut for some reason. We can see here that the version of the Hornet included in Battle on the Edge looks slightly different to the one that was in Power Edition, with an extra hood scoop detail on the bonnet. I should probably just explain for the benefit of any American viewers, bonnet is what we call the hood over here, and has got nothing to do with jaunty Easter hats. And through the magical science of ROM hackery and save states, it is possible to play this version of the Hornet in Battle on the Edge, even if you're a non-coding muggle like me. Whilst it is fully playable, unfortunately this version of the Hornet is broken and will start to decelerate as soon as you start trying to turn left or right. So unfortunately, you're not going to be able to win any races with this one, champ. You'll notice the CPU cars in this are missing most of their bodywork decals. This is owing to the fact I can only run this save state on an older version of Supermodel, before things were quite as polished as they are today. Hey, so here's another new update from 2021. At the end of last year, somebody left a comment on one of my YouTube videos to mention the fact that the website The Cutting Room Floor had discovered that this secret version of the Hornet was actually playable in Battle on the Edge without having to resort to ROM hackery. By moving the gear stick into 4th gear before you get to the course selection screen and then pressing the view select buttons in a certain order, you will now access this secret version of the Hornet, in place of the usual 3 cars, with the game announcing it as a special secret car for specialists only. Differently to the hacked version as well, the car's stats can be modified using the view buttons and steering wheel.
Beginner, you can use the secret car. Please decide the setting of the car. Hornet Classic. Please choose manual or automatic transmission. Manual.
Now, on my initial try with this, I was just using an Xbox 360 pad, and to me it didn't really feel like a massive improvement to that hacked version that you could access in terms of the issues with speed loss. But I then gave it a try with my racing wheel, and it made a big difference. You don't automatically lose tons of speed when you just move left and right. But having said that though, there's something about the handling of the car that I'm still just not quite getting. If I try doing a Daytona USA 1 424 drift around the corner, I seem to lose so much speed that it makes it really hard for me to actually catch up with the CPU cars, and I'm getting slow lap times. Again, having said that though, this is still a massive improvement over the hacked version. Using that car I could barely get out of the high 30s position wise, but using this one I was actually able to finish a race in 12th. So I don't know if the fact that it slows down so much when I'm trying to gear drift is because this car's still a bit broken, or maybe I'm just not specialist enough to use the specialist car. In my defence here though, I have been able to get a first place on the beginner circuit in Power Edition using the Hornet, using the exact same drifting technique that I use in Daytona USA 1, without any problems with speed loss or anything like that. Anyway, regardless of whether it's broken or not, it's incredible that this is a secret that the game is only now just revealing over 20 years after its release. Another interesting quirky little feature about being able to access the network in the game now is the fact that it means that you can now access the game's live camera option. This was a feature first seen in Virtua Racing and the original Sega Rally, where a separate machine would act as a live camera showing the race from all sorts of different angles. Virtua Racing also included a commentator called Vert McPolygon, whose comments would appear in text form on the live camera. Daytona USA 2 actually upped the ante a little bit over Virtua Racing here, by having its commentary in the form of sampled speech, including interviews with your pit chief. Now, as I mentioned earlier, at present it's not possible to actually get the network running full speed, but by using the magic of video editing and actually speeding the video up, it is just about possible to make out what they're saying. Let's have a listen.
Let's check the current position. Car number 7 is at the top. And it is trying against car number 2 crew. Why did you just drag I hope the result of the that is why the I will return to my 7. Let's go. Who will win? Let's check the current position. Car number 7 is at the top. And in second is car number 82. And in third is car number 8. The other positions are as follows. 6. Let's go. Come on! Come on! Come on! Let's check the current position.
Another interesting feature of the live cam was that if you played on the challenge course, the game actually displayed the names of all the corners as you played through it. Although there was no live commentary when you played on the challenge course, unlike the standard 3 tracks. Man, you gotta love all the attention to detail Sega used to put into their games back then. Now to me, this is just another one of those features which really helped make Sega arcade races a cut above the rest, and really helped them stand out from the crowd. Now at the time that I'm recording this, which is late June in 2018, the original Daytona USA is still available to purchase from the PlayStation Network, which, using my Sherlock Holmes-like powers of deduction, means that Sega must still have the license for the game. Which begs the question then, Sega, why haven't you ported Daytona USA 2 to current systems, you flaming idiots? Despite the fact I have played this game absolutely to death in emulation, I would still happily buy a digital download of this off the PlayStation Network if it meant I could play 16-player network multiplayer. I mean, come on Sega, what have you got to lose? Now, despite the massive popularity of Daytona USA, and the fact that people still enjoy playing the game today, one of the curious things about it is the fact that Daytona USA 2 is still to this day the only sequel the game's ever received. All of that looked like it might be changing in 2016 though, when this cryptic image appeared online suggesting that a new Daytona was going to appear at the International Association of Amusement Parks and Attractions event of that same year. Were we finally going to be getting Daytona USA 3? No. No, of course we fucking weren't. This is modern day Sega we're talking about. So the game that was initially teased as Daytona USA 3 in fact turned out to be a remake of the original Daytona USA, but with modern day graphics. A game that eventually dropped the 3 from its title and would go on to be known as Daytona Championship USA. So, a modern remake of Daytona USA, huh? What could possibly go wrong? So Daytona Championship USA, what could possibly go wrong? Well, turns out quite a bit actually. When the official Sega press blurbs for the game very first came out, they mentioned that the game would feature 3 brand new stages, but these 3 brand new stages simply turned out to be lazy reskins of the original 3 tracks in mirrored mode. And in fact, now that I think about it, the beginner stage wasn't even mirrored. Pretty much all of the music in the game had been recycled from the Dreamcast version of Daytona USA 2001, and when footage of the game first started to appear online, people were less than impressed with the visual style of the game, with people complaining that it looked more like a first generation PlayStation 3 or Xbox 360 game, rather than a brand new arcade game that was released in 2017. Another criticism levelled at it was that it simply looked bland and didn't have any of the character of the original Daytona USA, like the fact the cars didn't shake and judder about when they were moving like in the original game, or Battle on the Edge or Power Edition. Once some early versions of the game started appearing at trade fairs, there was criticism levelled at the controls because the cabinet's racing wheels had a huge dead zone, meaning the steering was imprecise and just generally a bit shit. Another major problem identified with the cabinets was that they only came with an up and down sequential shifter, rather than the 4-way 8 shifter the old Daytona USA cabinets used to have, meaning it was impossible to do the advanced drifting techniques such as going from 4th to 2nd back to 4th again. As fails go, I'm afraid that's a pretty epic one, Sega. I mean, how could something so essential to the fundamental mechanics of how you play the game get missed out like that? It's almost as if the team working on this remake had no idea how you're actually supposed to play it, for fuck's sake. This was eventually rectified as Sega subsequently offered arcade vendors the opportunity to install the 4-way 8 shifter, rather than the up and down sequential ones the cabs came with as a default. But as fails of epic proportions go, we haven't actually got to the biggest doozy of them all yet. We'll come on to that later. I've heard it suggested by people who sound like they know what they're talking about, that to all extents and purposes this actually is the Model 2 original at its core, running with a modern graphics engine. So if the team working on this were just simply adding a new lick of paint to an old Daytona game, I've often wondered to myself why they didn't just simply use the Dreamcast game as a template. As we discussed earlier in the video, when played with the racing wheel it feels practically identical to the Model 2 game when using the Hornet on the original 3 stages. On top of that, it's got all those extra bonus cars and new racetracks. Plus, as I've already mentioned, 99% of the music from Daytona Championship USA was lifted directly from the Dreamcast game anyway. Or, you know, here's another radical thought, Sega. How about making an actual Daytona USA 3 that doesn't rely on 100% recycled content? Oh well, seems like a bit of a missed opportunity to me. Anyway, let's have a look at the game in action with a lap on each track, starting with the original 3 and then the new mirrored versions. Now for some weird reason, the default number of laps on the advanced and expert tracks are different to the original game here, with just 3 on the advanced and 1 on expert. I can still get a first place on the advanced stage with no problem in just 3 laps, but so far getting first on the expert track with just 1 lap has proved a bit beyond my skill level. Anyway, let's check them out.
Please select the race course. 37 Speedway. Please choose manual or automatic transmission. Ladies and gentlemen, start your engine.
This is your crew chief. You're in a rolling start. Good luck.
Wait a second, Metro City? Doesn't that mean that this guy's the mayor of this place? Anyway, that's enough Final Fight related shenanigans. Let's get back to this game. Now, I must admit, I was part of that group of people that went from being incredibly excited about the announcement of Daytona USA 3 to rapidly becoming more and more disappointed after finding out it was a remake and then seeing the initial footage online. But having now had the chance to sit down and spend some time with the game, I have revised my opinion somewhat. I think the big, bright, bold, colourful, almost slightly cartoonish graphics suit Daytona USA very well. And most importantly, they retain the sense of speed, keeping that all-important 60 frames a second, which is so crucial to the Daytona experience. And whilst I still think that just simply reusing 3 of the original tracks in mirror mode and reskinning them was incredibly lazy, particularly as the initial press releases for the game were saying that we were going to be getting 3 brand new tracks, I do like the aesthetic of the reskin versions, particularly Metro City and Lakeside Castle. I do think it's a shame that they couldn't have done something a little bit more exciting with the reskin of 77 Speedway, and simply turning it into a real-life version of the Daytona International Speedway track. I mean, how super awesome would it have been to have seen a return of the Biodome from Battle on the Edge? Yeah, I know if Sega weren't interested in keeping it in Power Edition back in the 1990s, there's even less chance of them doing it now. And that's not to say that I don't like the Daytona International Speedway track, it's just that, you know, it could have been more interesting. Gameplay wise, as far as I can tell, this handles exactly like the original game, right down to the rocket start even working exactly the same way, with the only real difference I could notice being that you seem to get penalised with much greater loss of speed if you clip a wall or another car. So fortunately, those issues that were mentioned with the early beta versions of the game with the massive dead zone seem to have just been an issue with those early display models of the game. As well as the ability to play the game in a quick race, there's also a championship mode, where you have to race across 3 different tracks, coming either first, second or third, in order to qualify and move on to the next race. There are now 5 different cars which the player can use when playing the game, with the choice of vehicle and the livery that it's in being tied to specific tracks. So all in all then, despite my initial reservations, I have actually really enjoyed Daytona Championship USA, despite the fact there is that whiff of lazy half-arsedness about the game, which I think is particularly exemplified by the reuse of all the old Daytona USA 2001 music from the Dreamcast. Now, I'd mentioned earlier that there was one particularly big epic fail that was associated with this game. A fail so big, so gargantuan, it's almost impossible to believe that it could have ever actually happened in the first place. At the end of 2017, Sega released an update for this game, which was available for arcade vendors to download for free from their website. It turned out that this update contained the entire game, and it wasn't long before a talented group of coders and hackers across a number of different forums across different countries managed to at first get the game to boot in Windows PCs, and then over a period of incremental updates, managed to at first get the controls partially working, if you were using an Xbox 360 pad, to eventually fully working with racing wheels, right down to working force feedback. It's got to the point now that people have even figured out how to get multiplayer working across multiple PCs. Now, I still can't quite fully fathom how this was able to happen. I mean, releasing an update for the game, which contains the entire game itself, that was only supposed to be downloaded by arcade vendors, on a public website, must rank as one of the most stupid things I've ever heard. It's like the equivalent of me leaving my car keys on full display on my dashboard, with a note to say, "Here's my car for Dave to drive, but you can only drive it if you're Dave. I'm 100% certain that none of the other people on this busy street will want to take it out for a test drive." Sega, you absolute muppets. What were you thinking? Still, not that I'm complaining, mind you. I'm yet to encounter an actual Daytona USA Championship arcade cabinet anywhere, so if Sega hadn't released this onto the internet, I probably would have never got a chance to actually play it. I have heard it mentioned as well, that the real money from this game comes from the cabinet sales, rather than the software, so maybe this getting leaked onto the internet isn't really hurting Sega that much. The cabinets themselves feature something called a spectator video billboard marquee, and have cameras that film the players as they're playing the game, showing their reactions in-game. The game also features a party mode, which is designed to give operators the ability to pre-program private events, and run them right from the game. So hey, here's just a little addition to the original video. In 2019, Sega released a free-to-download software upgrade for the game. This upgrade included improved car handling, new dynamic in-game camera, new graphics and improved lighting, new car models and damage modelling, new top 3 race highlights, new car liveries, and updated live player camera. It seems that Sega learnt from the leak of the full game though, because the upgrade required arcade operators to fill in an online form and request the digital download of it. And as far as I'm aware, this content has so far stayed exclusive to the arcade, and I'm adding this little updated section into the video in 2021, 3 years after my original upload of the first version of this video, and I'm still yet to see a Daytona Championship USA cabinet in the arcade. So as it is, I'm yet to experience this software upgrade. I'm curious as to what the improved handling means though. As I mentioned in the original video, the handling is pretty much spot on compared to the original Model 2 version, with the only difference I could really notice being that your car loses a lot more speed if you clip an opponent or one of the barriers. So have they tried to make the handling even closer to the original Model 2 game, or have they done something different with it? Who knows. One thing I can tell you though, without actually playing the game, just from the videos I've seen of it, I'm really not the biggest fan of those new liveries. Also, just going by the little bit of the track screen of the Lakeside track that we saw there, it seems like a little bit of an odd choice artistically that they decided to turn the Lakeside track's background back to a blue sky rather than this nice purpley sunset one that we've got here. I think this is something that really helps make it more distinct from Dinosaur Canyon. Something else which I hadn't really given a massive amount of thought to until I started replaying the game to get all this new footage for the updated version of the video is the fact that your traffic radar's missing in this new version. So it's a shame that this didn't get added back in with this new update to the game. Particularly as the announcer seems to be screaming at you to guard your tail constantly throughout the game, or look out behind you. The radar really was a useful gameplay addition and helped you play a little bit more tactically. For example, on the expert course here, if the radar had been working, I would have been able to see this CPU prick creeping up on my left hand side and blocked him, and I would have ended up coming in 4th instead of 5th. What's that? Me? Bitter? No, of course not. Well, I think that pretty much comprehensively covers everything to do with Daytona Championship USA. We're in the home stretch now, so let's move on to the final part of the video, which is looking at Daytona USA's Legacy. So in some respects, we have already been talking about Daytona USA's Legacy. From the modern remake, Daytona Championship USA, the sort of re-release of Daytona USA in the arcades before this, Sega Racing Classics, the 2 proper numbered sequels, Battle on the Edge and Power Edition, all the various home ports and expansions of the original game, and then of course not forgetting about the fact that despite never getting a home port of its own, the Daytona 2 Power Edition tracks eventually appeared in the Xbox port of Outrun 2. But what other media and games has Daytona USA had an influence on, and which games have referenced it directly? Let's step back in time now, back to the mid-1990s in the era of the Sega Saturn, and what must rank as one of the most bizarre cameos ever for the Daytona Hornet in a computer game. Ladies and gentlemen, I give you Fighters Megamix. Fighters Megamix was one of the Saturn's swan song games. It was a fighting game created by Sega AM2 that combined all of the characters from their 2 previous games, Virtua Fighter and Fighting Vipers, as well as a host of characters from a whole load of other Sega games, with the last unlockable character being the Hornet from Daytona USA. So now you can witness the absolute weirdness of seeing Sarah from Virtua Fighter beating up the Hornet. Now, although I did used to own this for the Saturn back in the day, much like my copy of Daytona USA CCE, I sold this many years ago, so I'm relying on an emulator to play it here. So in the version that I'm playing here using SSF emulator, there is unfortunately no sound, and most of the sound effects aren't working as well, but funnily enough, the Hornet's engine sounds are one of the few sound effects that do work. Unlike Virtua Fighter, the characters in Fighting Vipers wore armour, which would slowly take damage the more hits they took. If they took enough, it would smash off altogether. And the Hornet does play like a Fighting Vipers character, so its outer chassis is like its armour. You can choose to get rid of the army yourself though, and doing this suddenly gives the Hornet a whole load of extra moves, although it does make it more vulnerable to damage from the other players. So yeah, the game really is batshit crazy. There's nothing more surreal than the sight of the automatic Hornet beating up the manual transmission Hornet. Oh, there we go. As I'm sure you probably noticed, the Hornet stage is based on 777 Speedway. It even has the King of Speed as its background theme, the music that normally plays on the beginner stage in Daytona USA. Anywho, that's enough time spent with Pfizer's Megamix. Let's move on to our next game. The next appearance of the Hornet was in the 2012 kart racing game Sonic and All-Star Racing Transformed, and it was created by Sumo Digital, the guys behind the excellent Xbox port of Outrun 2 and all the other home conversions of Outrun Coast to Coast. Sonic Transformed was initially released on the PS3 and the Xbox 360, before later receiving a PC port as well. I initially started off with the PS3 version of the game, before moving on to the PC version after I found out it supported 60 frames a second. Because, you know me and frame rates. The transform mechanic worked in such a way that each player had a land-based mode, a flying mode, and an aquatic mode. And the Hornet was no exception, with its flying form being represented by an F-14 from the old Sega arcade game Afterburner, and its aquatic form looking like a hydrofoil boat that resembled a Dreamcast controller. As homages go to old Sega games, I think this is a lovely touch. Collectively, the three combined forms were known as the character Ages. Cause you see, it's Sega backwards, isn't it? It's the Sega backwards. Characters were unlocked in the game by gaining stars for completing missions as you played through it. And Ages was the very last character to be unlocked, because Sega and Sumo Digital love to torture me. Despite the game's very child-friendly appearance, don't be fooled. The game was rock hard on some of the later difficulty settings, and unfortunately you did have to go through those in order to actually access this character. I say unfortunately, but that's really just me being a whingy old man. I bet some of you young scallywags absolutely loved the challenge. But for me, as much as I love the game, and I do truly love this game, every time one of those cheating CPU bastards shot me from behind, as I desperately tried to claw enough stars together to unlock this character, I'm amazed that my PlayStation 3 pad didn't end up embedded in the TV screen. Fortunately, once I got the PC version, I didn't need to go through all that torture all over again, because I unlocked the characters via other means. Now, years ago, I did hear a rumour over on the official Sega forums that there was talk originally in the game's development of putting a Daytona USA track in here. Now, I don't know if that's just hearsay or if there's any factual basis behind it at all, but it's a real shame they didn't. How cool would that have been? A Sonic and All-Stars version of 3.7 Speedway and all the other Daytona tracks. Well, guess we can dream. Now, whilst we're still on the subject of Sonic and All-Star Transformed and Daytona USA Legacy, in an example of virtual life imitating virtual art, I noticed a while ago when I was watching the film Wreck-It Ralph that one of the arcade machines in the back of the arcade has got the Daytona Hornet on its marquee. It's got a different name, but it's still definitely the Hornet. And the reason that this is all connected is because of the fact that Wreck-It Ralph himself was a guest character in Sonic and All-Stars Transformed. Sonic and All-Star Transformed is definitely one of my favourite games of the previous generation of consoles, and it's well worth checking out if you've never played it, particularly if you're a fan of old school Sega games. It's got an absolutely wicked soundtrack as well. The next guest appearance of the Hornet in another game was an incredibly surprising one. It was available as a DLC car for the PlayStation Vita version of Ridge Racer, together with a DLC song that you can purchase to go with it, which is called Ridge Racer USA Mix, sung by none other than the legend that is Takenobu Mitsuyoshi, which sounds like a mashup of Let's Go Away from the original Daytona USA and the tune Ridge Racer from the first Ridge Racer game. It's kind of awesome in a surreal meta sort of way. Now, I don't actually own a PlayStation Vita, so I've never actually got to play this game, and I was under the impression that this particular DLC was Japan only. But out of curiosity, I just had a quick look on the EU PSN, and both the car and the song are available to buy over here. Now, in some ways, for me at any rate, seeing the Hornet cameoing in a Ridge Racer game is almost weirder than seeing it beat itself up in Fighters Megamix. Bearing in mind what bitter rivals Sega and Namco were back in the 1990s, and the fact that the Ridge Racer series was one of the main competitors for most of Sega's arcade racers. But I guess in this day and age, when you've got Sonic and Mario starring in games together, Sarah from Virtua Fighter making a guest appearance in Dead or Alive, Akuma from Street Fighter guest starring in Tekken, it probably isn't that weird after all. So these are all of the appearances of the Hornet in other media that I'm aware of. Do you know of any more? Let me know in the comments below. And when we're talking about Daytona USA's Legacy, it's hard not to see its influence on a lot of other games that have come after it, particularly games like Sega's own Scud Race, which is often described as a spiritual sequel to Daytona USA. Or Sega and Electronic Arts later returned to the world of arcade stock car racing, with Sega NASCAR Arcade, a game which is a bit of a poor relation of Daytona USA's in my opinion, but hey, at least they've got a rolling start in there. You can even see Daytona USA's influence in modern day racing games, like Hot Shot Racing here, an arcade racer that was released in 2020 that aesthetically owes a lot to Virtua Racing, but the Daytona influence on it is plain to see, such as the giant slot machine above one of the tracks, and the very Hornet-esque looking stock car that you can play as, another track filled with dinosaur fossils, and other trackside details like funfairs, roller coasters and castles. There's even been an unofficial remake of Daytona USA for Android devices called Daytona Arcade Racing, that's Daytona with a T. Although it started out in life as a mobile game, it was eventually removed from the Google Play Store, so continued development of the game was transferred to the PC. Now, I've got to give the game's developer AES Software 10 out of 10 for effort here, particularly in taking up the reins where Sega themselves have failed to capitalise on the mobile game market for something like Daytona USA. But personally, I must admit, I've never been all that bothered about trying out this game. I mean, yeah, for an unofficial mobile phone port, they've done an admirable job, but it just doesn't look that good really, does it? To quote Paul Newman, why would I go out for hamburgers when I've got steak at home? That metaphorical steak being the Model 2 original game and Daytona Championship USA. There was even a Kickstarter started by someone to create a 90s style arcade racer, which looked like the most beautiful love letter to Sega games of old. Sadly though, the developer Nickel Arse got involved with it, and it now looks like it's turned into vaporware. Nickel Arse, if you're watching this, you still owe me £20, you bastard wankers. Maybe the game will still see the light of day eventually, but considering the Kickstarter was started in 2013, I'm not holding out any hope for it. Which is such a shame because the game looks absolutely gorgeous. When that initial announcement about Daytona USA 3 first went out, this was the sort of thing I was hoping we were going to get. Let's just take a moment now to kick back and see what could have been. Now hold on just a tire screeching second here. Literally just as I was about to start uploading this, a little voice suddenly popped up in my brain, reminding me that I've been caught out by third-party match content strikes on YouTube before from unexpected sources. And it suddenly occurred to me that all the music in these videos could potentially be a source of a third-party strike, even though I don't think it's been commercially used anywhere apart from in this game, which has never been released. So just to be on the safe side, I'm going to use a bit of music from some old Sega classics here. If you want to see these working with the sound effects and the correct music, then use the links in the description. Anyway, enough talk, let's crack on. I just don't get it. If you've got a game that looks this complete and this gorgeous, why would you just sit on it and do absolutely fuck all with it? I mean, nickel arse. If you're not going to do anything with it, why don't you sell it to a developer that will? Like, I don't know, Sega. Now, if you can remember that far back, because I have been talking for a very long time, I mentioned right at the start of the video that Daytona USA still frequently pops up and lists of the best arcade games ever and the most influential driving games of all time. And it's not just games magazines and gaming websites that have taken notice. Even the mainstream media are writing articles about Daytona USA's enduring appeal and just why it remains so popular and so influential after 25 years. And if you're someone who previously wasn't all that familiar with the game and you've made it all the way to the end of the video, now hopefully you'll have more of an idea why this is the case too. And if you're someone who was already a big fan of Daytona USA, then hopefully I might have been able to reveal a Daytona factoid or two that you weren't previously aware of. I really hadn't planned for this project to be quite so gargantuan in length as it's turned out to be. But hey, sometimes shit happens and you've just got to go with it. So once again, if you've made it all the way to the end of the video, then thank you so much for sharing in 25 years of Daytona USA with me. I hope you've enjoyed it. You're obviously a YouTuber of great discerning taste and are no doubt very handsome as well, so just remember I said that when it comes to hitting that there old like button. And with that, as we approach the final corner with the finish line dead ahead, all that remains now is for me to say I've been Mr. Thunderwing, thank you for watching, and goodbye. But hey, don't be a stranger. Come on by any time.
Hello kids, it's TV's Admiral Akbar here. If you like this video, then make sure to like, share and subscribe. Why not check out some more of Mr. Thundering's Sega related videos? It's not a trap! Ho 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 ho!